Warming up in weightlifting competition requires timing the warm-up lifts to prepare you to take your opening lift on the competition platform at the time you're called. This is part science and part art because timing is only partly predictable and changes throughout the session. This video will give you the basics of how to time warm-ups, and in future videos I'll get into more of the details of competition coaching. The outline of the process is simple. Count how many competition attempts will take place before your lifter opens, and then use the completion of competition attempts as the schedule to time your athlete's warm-up lifts. The first step is getting an initial count of how far out the lifter is from taking their first lift. Ideally, you have access to the populated scoreboard or attempt cards at the time you're doing this. If your athlete is one of the best in the session, there are plenty of lifters in the session, and your athlete doesn't have an unusually long warm-up, there's no rush and you can wait for cards or the scoreboard to get your initial count. We'll assume this is the case to go over the basics of counting first. Counting attempts is simply estimating how many lifts will be taken on the competition platform before your lifter takes theirs. Find all attempts lower than your lifter's opener. This is easiest on a scoreboard because the lifters will be listed in order of lowest to highest openers. The protocol with cards these days is that they remain in the same position on the table regardless of the weights, so you have to pay more attention and look at all of them. Estimate how many attempts each lifter will take before yours. This means making assumptions on weight increases. In the snatch, we can expect 2 to 4 kilos for women and 3 to 6 kilos for men. In the clean and jerk, we may be looking at 3 to 6 kilos for women and 4 to 8 for men. We can also assume that larger lifters with bigger weights will take larger increases between attempts. Always account for possible 2-minute clocks. This can be because a lifter's opener is much lower than the next lifter, so they'll have to follow themselves, or because if certain lifters miss certain weights, they'll have to follow themselves. Here, for example, Carlins will take at least 2 lifts before the next athlete, so that's 1 2-minute clock. If he misses, he could have 2 2-minute clocks. Simply add an attempt for each 2-minute clock because it's similar to 2 lifters taking attempts instead of 1. Also pay attention to the start numbers for each lifter because this will determine the order for lifters opening at the same weights. For example, here in the clean and jerk, there are 4 lifters opening at 170. Brown has the lowest start number, so he'll open first, and McDonald will open last with the highest start number. So even though the weights are the same, McDonald will have 3 more attempts than Brown to warm up. Let's do an example count for John Downey on this scoreboard, which is from the session of his national championship win. Luckily, we've got a scoreboard. It's easy to see all of the lifts are going to be before John's opener at 139. Starting with Carlin's opening at 121, we're obviously going to have all 3 attempts for him before John's 139. However, we need to look at 2-minute clocks here. He's 9 kilos below the next lifter, Brown, at 130. So at the very least, he's going to take 2 attempts. If he goes 121, 126, 131, he would be 2 attempts, and then Brown would open at 130 before Carlin's 3rd attempt at 131. However, I'm going to say that's pretty unlikely, so I'm going to consider him doing all 3 lifts before 130, which means that not only are we going to have those 3 attempts, but he's going to be following himself for all 3 attempts, which means we have 2 2-minute clocks. So instead of being just 3 attempts, we're going to count that as 5 attempts. Brown's going to be opening next at 130, and I'm going to give him at least 2 attempts, 130, 134, 135. It may even be 3 if he goes 130, 134, 138, 137, something along those lines. What I'll likely do is count that as 3 because I'm going to be trying to work in possible misses in this session to kind of pad the count a little bit. We do know that even if he has a miss, he's likely not going to have a 2-minute clock because the next lifter is also opening at 130, and then the lifter after that is opening at 132. So they should be grouped pretty close together, and very likely they're going to be going back and forth among each other. Carlson's also opening at 130, and I'm going to go ahead and call that 3 again in case we get a miss or smaller jumps. Keep in mind when you're doing these counts too that these openers are not set in stone. Any of these lifters could bump up those openers. They could even lower their openers at the last second, and that's going to throw your count off. If you're lucky, you've been around a while, you're familiar with some of these lifters, and you kind of know their habits and practices. And so you may know, hey, this guy's most likely going to bump his opener, or no, he always stays with that opener set. 9 kilos is a pretty big gap, though, so I'm going to go ahead and count this as 3. If it were a couple kilos smaller, I might hedge, and if there were 2 of them at 132 instead of at 130, I might count 1 as 3 attempts and 1 as 2 attempts to kind of hedge my bets there. Next, we have McDonald opening at 132. Again, I'm going to give him at least 2 attempts. Let's say 32 to 36 or 37 if he's feeling good. And if that 37 is good, he's probably not going to go to 38. And even if he goes to 39, he'd still follow John because that would be McDonald's 2nd attempt versus John's 1st attempt. So first attempts go first. That said, I can still count him as 3 because we're talking about potential misses, and maybe he's not feeling good and he's going to take small jumps. And then the last lifter, Suma, opening at 135. I'm going to go ahead and give him 2 lifts there. He could potentially go 135 to 140, but I'm going to assume here that he's going to take 2 attempts. Again, this is just kind of padding that count a little bit for potential misses, which are bound to happen. I've never seen a session with all green on the scoreboard by the end. So that gives us for our total count, 5 plus 3 is 8, plus another 3 is 11, plus another 3 is 14, plus a final 2 is 16 total lifts before John opens at 139. Once you have your count, align your lifter's warm-ups with the competition attempts. It's standard to take a warm-up lift every 3 attempts on the platform, which will mean about every 3 minutes, taking the final warm-up lift 3 attempts out. Keep in mind that in national competitions, there will be athlete introductions at the session start time, and then a 10-minute clock once those are finished, after which the first lifter of the session will be called to the platform. Take this into account when timing the warm-ups. Here are the warm-up lifts for John's opener at 139. As you see, the final warm-up at 135 is taken 3 attempts out, and from there we add 3 to every warm-up lift, which brings us to 36 attempts for his first lift on the bar. In a session with enough lifters and him opening toward the end, this would work as written. We would simply take the first warm-up on the bar once there were 36 remaining attempts before his opener. In this case, we have a very small session, and there aren't even 36 total attempts in the entire session, so we have to go a bit farther in planning. As we determined with our initial count, there are only 16 attempts before he opens. This means we have to start the warm-up before the session actually begins, so we need to time any warm-ups beyond 16 out on a clock. We start with the 10-minute clock that will run after introductions. That still doesn't get us enough time, so now we go to the actual clock and count backward from the session start time of 11 a.m. when athletes will be called for introductions. This puts our first lift on the bar at 10:50 a.m. Now let's say for whatever reason we're not able to start that early. We can adjust a bit more by compressing the timing of the earliest warm-ups since they'll be easy and really don't require much rest. We'll take those down to 2 minutes instead of 3, which buys us another 6 minutes total. If we're really behind, we can drop 1 or 2 of the sets with the bar and 50 kilos to gain even a few more minutes. If your athlete is very likely to be near the beginning of the session, you can't wait for cards or the scoreboard to get your initial count because they'll need to start warming up earlier than those arrive in most cases. Use the start list to get a gross estimate of timing by looking at the entry totals. This will at least give you a sense of where in the group of athletes yours will be opening. If it's going to be early, you're going to need to start warming up before the session actually starts. In this case, you'll simply need to use a clock. Work backward from the time of the first lift will be called to determine the warm-up schedule. Make sure you also account for whatever warm-up the lifter needs to do before getting on the barbell. This can be as much as 30 minutes for some lifters. Now all you have to do is have your lifter take each warm-up lift at the time that coincides with your plan. Check the scoreboard regularly because other lifters' openers will often be changed at the last minute, and lifters' weight increases may not align with your assumptions during your initial count. Don't assume once you have your initial count that it's set in stone. The best way to improve at warming lifters up in competition is to warm more lifters up in competition. If you're not yet coaching in competition or you want extra practice, just use the photo of the scoreboard in this video or create one and practice counting for different athletes, making up different scenarios like last-minute opener changes, having to mix attempt counts with the clock, and unexpected misses. Greg Everett with Catalyst Athletics here. Please subscribe, like, and share this video. If you have questions, post them in the comments. I answer all of them. Also check out catalystathletics.com for the biggest Olympic weightlifting exercise library out there, along with hundreds of free articles and videos and other resources for both athletes and coaches.